The hardest goodbye is not always the one where love disappears. Sometimes it is the one where love remains, but reality finally becomes impossible to ignore. An empath can remember every painful conversation, every moment of manipulation, every time they were blamed for problems they did not create, and every moment they felt emotionally exhausted, yet still find themselves grieving when the relationship ends. That is the part most people do not understand. Why would someone mourn a relationship that repeatedly hurt them? Why would they miss someone they know was unhealthy for them? And why can the heart continue reaching backward when the mind already knows it is time to move forward? The answer goes much deeper than simply saying the empath loved too much. In many cases, the empath is not only grieving the person, they are grieving the memories, the hope, the emotional investment, the future they imagined, and the version of the relationship they spent so long trying to create. They may even be grieving a version of themselves that existed before the relationship slowly changed how they saw love, trust, and their own boundaries. One of the lesser-known parts of this kind of grief is that the empath may have started mourning the relationship long before it actually ended. Every broken promise, every disappointing conversation, every moment when affection felt uncertain, and every time they lowered their expectations may have created small losses that accumulated over time. So when the final separation happens, all of that buried emotion can suddenly come to the surface. The silence after the relationship can feel unusually heavy because the empath is no longer busy trying to understand, fix, explain, forgive, or hold everything together. For the first time, there is nothing left to chase, and that silence can force them to face a painful question: what exactly am I grieving? In this video, we are going to uncover the deeper psychology behind why empaths can grieve narcissistic relationships, even when they know the relationship was hurting them. You will learn why they can miss someone without truly wanting the relationship back, why good memories can make healing more confusing, why they may become trapped replaying the past and searching for answers, and why the loss of hope can sometimes hurt more than the loss of the person. We will also explore the hidden grief that comes from losing a future that never happened, the identity they built around helping someone else, and the part of themselves they may feel disappeared along the way. Most importantly, you will understand why grief does not automatically mean the decision to leave was wrong. Sometimes grief is simply the emotional price of finally accepting a truth the mind understood long before the heart was ready to accept it. And by the end of this video, you may see your own healing differently, because the deepest wound may not be that you lost someone. It may be that you finally realized how much of yourself you had been giving away while hoping the relationship would become what you always believed it could be. So stay with me until the end, because the final truth may completely change the way you understand this kind of grief. Welcome to our channel, where we explore the hidden psychology behind human behavior, emotional patterns, relationships, and the moments that quietly change us. If you want to understand yourself and others on a deeper level, make sure you subscribe to the channel, because there is much more to uncover. When an empath walks away from a painful relationship, the outside world may see a simple ending. Two people were together, the relationship became unhealthy, and eventually it ended. But emotionally, the ending can be far more complicated than that. The empath is rarely grieving only the person standing on the other side of the breakup. They may be grieving an entire emotional world that existed around that person. They may be grieving the routines they built, the conversations they became used to, the memories that filled ordinary days, the plans they quietly carried in their mind, and the future they believed they were moving toward. This is one of the first things that makes narcissistic relationships so difficult to process. The relationship may have caused pain, but it also occupied a large amount of emotional space. The empath may have spent months or even years thinking about the relationship, analyzing the other person's behavior, trying to understand their moods, adjusting their own reactions, and searching for ways to make things better. Their mind was constantly engaged. Their heart was constantly involved. Their attention was constantly pulled toward the relationship. So when the relationship ends, the empath does not simply lose a partner. They suddenly lose a role. They lose the person they were always trying to understand. They lose the problem they were always trying to solve. They lose the hope that their next conversation might finally change everything. For a person who naturally feels deeply and pays close attention to the emotions of others, this can create a very particular kind of emptiness. There is suddenly no one to reassure, no conflict to analyze, no hidden meaning to search for, no emotional crisis to manage. The silence can feel uncomfortable because the mind has been trained to stay alert to the relationship. For a long time, the empath may have started each day thinking about what happened yesterday, what might happen today, and how they could prevent another conflict tomorrow. Then one day, that entire emotional routine disappears. the absence can feel like a loss of purpose. This is why simply telling an empath to forget the person can be almost useless. Forgetting the person does not immediately erase the emotional structure that was built around them. The empath has to slowly understand what they were actually attached to. Sometimes they were attached to love. Sometimes they were attached to hope. Sometimes they were attached to the possibility of finally being understood. And sometimes they were attached to the role of being the person who could reach someone nobody else seemed able to reach. That role can become powerful because it gives the empath a sense of meaning. They may begin believing that their patience matters, their understanding matters, their forgiveness matters, and their ability to see the wounded side of another person gives them a unique place in that person's life. The relationship becomes more than a relationship. It becomes a mission. The empath may quietly think, if I can understand what caused this behavior, maybe I can respond differently. They may think, if I stay calm enough, maybe they will stop becoming defensive. They may think, if I show enough love, maybe they will finally feel safe enough to change. They may think, if I explain my feelings in the right way, maybe they will finally understand. None of these thoughts necessarily come from weakness. In many cases, they come from compassion. The problem begins when compassion turns into responsibility for another person's emotional development. The empath starts carrying a burden that was never theirs to carry. They become responsible for keeping the relationship stable. They become responsible for understanding the other person. They become responsible for repairing every disagreement. They become responsible for staying patient when the other person refuses to take responsibility for their own behavior. Over time, this can create a strange emotional imbalance. One person is living the relationship, while the other person is constantly managing it. The empath is no longer simply loving someone. They are monitoring the relationship. They are studying reactions. They are choosing words carefully. They are trying to predict what might trigger another argument. They are remembering what worked last time and avoiding what did not. They are giving more emotional energy to maintaining peace than they are receiving from the relationship itself. And when the relationship finally ends, they can feel lost because the role they played has disappeared. This is why the grief can feel much larger than the length of the relationship might suggest. The empath is not measuring the loss only in months or years together. Their nervous system is processing the loss of an entire emotional routine. Then another layer begins to appear. The empath may realize that they were not only attached to who the narcissistic partner actually was, they were attached to who they believed that person could become. This distinction can completely change the way the breakup is understood. In the beginning, the relationship may have felt powerful. There may have been intense attention, emotional closeness, exciting conversations, promises about the future, or moments when the other person appeared unusually vulnerable. The empath may have seen a side of them that felt rare and deeply personal. When difficult behavior appeared later, the empath could interpret it through the lens of the beginning. They may have thought the difficult behavior was caused by fear, insecurity, past wounds, stress, or an inability to trust. They may have believed that the loving person they saw earlier was the real person, and that the painful behavior was simply a defense covering that person. That belief can keep someone emotionally invested for a very long time. The empath is no longer responding only to what is happening in front of them. They are responding to what they believe could happen if the other person heals, changes, becomes honest, or finally understands the consequences of their actions. This creates one of the most painful forms of grief, grieving potential. Potential is powerful because it has no fixed ending. Reality can disappoint you, but potential can always promise another possibility. As long as the empath believes the relationship could become healthy, there is a reason to stay emotionally invested. Every apology can feel like evidence. Every good weekend can feel like evidence. Every moment of vulnerability can feel like evidence. Every promise to change can feel like evidence. The empath collects these moments because they support the future they are hoping for. But eventually, reality begins repeating itself. The same patterns return. The same conflicts return. The same emotional distance returns. The same blame returns. The same cycle begins again. This is where the empath faces a painful psychological conflict. Their heart remembers the potential, while reality keeps presenting the pattern. And when they finally leave, they may not be grieving only the person. They may be grieving the person they hoped would eventually appear. They may be mourning a future that existed in their imagination, but never became stable reality. They may have imagined peaceful conversations, mutual respect, emotional safety, shared goals, and a relationship where both people could finally meet each other with honesty. Letting go means accepting that this future may never happen with that person. That acceptance can feel like a second breakup. The first breakup is losing the relationship. The second is losing the belief that the relationship could still become what they wanted. That second loss is often harder to explain because there is nothing physical to point toward. There is no photograph of the future they imagined. There is no object that represents the plans they carried inside their mind. Yet emotionally that future was real enough to influence their choices. They organized their patience around it. They organized their sacrifices around it. They tolerated disappointment because they believed there would eventually be a reward for staying. When that hope disappears, the empath can feel as if they are losing something they never technically had. That is why someone can say, "I know the relationship was unhealthy, but I still miss it." They may not be missing the reality. They may be missing the possibility. And then there are the good memories. This is where grief becomes even more confusing. A painful relationship is rarely painful every minute of every day. There can be laughter, there can be affection, there can be moments of genuine closeness. There can be private jokes, shared experiences, late-night conversations, celebrations, trips, ordinary mornings, emotional confessions, and moments when the empath genuinely felt connected to the other person. Those memories do not disappear simply because the relationship ended badly. The brain does not delete positive experiences when someone realizes the relationship was unhealthy. Instead, those memories remain part of the emotional story. This can create a painful contradiction. The empath remembers being hurt, but they also remember feeling loved. They remember manipulation, but they also remember intimacy. They remember disappointment, but they also remember moments of happiness. The mind can move between these memories, sometimes within minutes. One memory makes them angry, another makes them nostalgic. Another makes them question their decision. Another reminds them why they left. This emotional back and forth can make healing feel like moving 2 steps forward and 1 step backward. But remembering a good moment does not mean the entire relationship was good. A harmful relationship can contain beautiful moments. A person can make you laugh and still hurt you. Someone can comfort you one day and emotionally destabilize you another day. A relationship can contain real affection and still be deeply unhealthy. This is an important distinction because the empath may believe that acknowledging the good means they must also reconsider the bad. It does not. You can say, "That moment was real," without saying, "The relationship was healthy." You can appreciate a memory without reopening the door. You can remember the kindness without forgetting the pattern. You can miss someone's presence without wanting their behavior back in your life. The human mind is capable of holding contradictory truths at the same time. The relationship may have contained love and pain. It may have contained connection and instability. It may have contained beautiful memories and damaging patterns. The presence of one does not erase the other. In fact, the contrast itself can make grief stronger because the empath is not mourning a completely negative experience. They are mourning the parts that felt worth saving. They are mourning the moments that made them believe the relationship could work. They are mourning the version of the person who sometimes seemed capable of giving them what they needed. And this is where the emotional confusion can become intense. The empath may ask themselves why they cannot simply focus on the bad. The answer is that healing is not a courtroom where every memory must be classified as good or bad. Healing is the process of seeing the entire pattern clearly. The goal is not to erase the good memories. The goal is to stop allowing the good memories to rewrite the whole story. Another reason the grief can become so intense is the amount of emotional labor the empath invested. Emotional labor is easy to overlook because it often leaves no visible evidence. Nobody sees the hours spent listening. Nobody sees the conversations replayed at 3 in the morning. Nobody sees the messages rewritten before sending. Nobody sees the moments when the empath swallowed their own anger because they were afraid another argument would make everything worse. Nobody sees how many times they tried to understand instead of reacting. Nobody sees the emotional energy required to remain patient when they were already exhausted. But the empath remembers. Their body remembers. Their mind remembers. Their sense of self remembers. They know how much they gave. They know how many times they tried. They know how many times they believed one more conversation could repair what had been damaged. That investment creates emotional weight. When the relationship ends, the empath may not only ask, "Why did they treat me this way?" They may also ask, "What was all of my effort for?" That question can be devastating. It can make them feel as though their love was wasted. But love is not meaningless simply because it did not produce the outcome someone hoped for. The care was real, the effort was real, the lessons were real, the growth can become real too. What changes is the meaning the empath gives those experiences. They may eventually understand that giving everything they had did not guarantee that the other person would meet them halfway. Sacrifice does not create reciprocity. Patience does not create maturity. Understanding does not create accountability. love does not force another person to change. This can be difficult for an empath to accept because their natural instinct may be to search for what they could have done differently. They may believe that if they can identify their mistake, they can make the story feel controllable. If it was their mistake, then perhaps they could have prevented the ending. But sometimes the relationship ended because the pattern itself was unsustainable. Sometimes there was no perfect sentence that would have fixed it. Sometimes there was no perfect amount of patience that would have created mutual respect. Sometimes the empath was trying to solve a problem that required participation from two people, while only one person was doing the work. As the grief continues, the empath may begin noticing another loss that has nothing to do with the other person. They may realize they are grieving themselves. Before the relationship, perhaps they trusted their instincts more easily. They said no without feeling guilty. They knew what they wanted. They felt comfortable spending time alone. They had interests that existed outside the relationship. They did not constantly question whether their feelings were valid. But slowly, the relationship may have changed their internal world. They began checking themselves before expressing an opinion. They began wondering whether they were too sensitive. They began explaining themselves repeatedly. They began apologizing for having needs. They began making excuses for behavior that would have once felt unacceptable. They began measuring their emotional state according to someone else's mood. If the other person was happy, they could relax. If the other person was angry, they became anxious. If the other person withdrew, they searched for a reason. If the other person returned with affection, they felt relief. Over time, the center of their emotional life moved away from themselves. Their attention became externally focused. So after the relationship ends, there can be a strange realization: I miss who I was. This is not the same as missing the partner. It is grief for the self that became smaller while trying to keep the relationship alive. It can feel like looking at an old version of yourself and realizing how much freedom you once had. You may remember how easily you laughed, how naturally you made decisions, how confidently you trusted your instincts. Then you compare that version of yourself to the person who spent hours trying to decode another person's behavior. That comparison can hurt, but it also contains an important opportunity. The empath can begin rebuilding the part of themselves they abandoned. They can learn to trust their own reactions again. They can recognize that discomfort does not always mean they are wrong. They can understand that boundaries are not cruelty. They can learn that saying no does not make them selfish. They can begin separating compassion from responsibility. They can care about another person's pain without making it their job to remove that pain. This is where grief begins revealing information. It starts showing the empath not only what they lost, but what they need to rebuild. After the relationship ends, another pattern can appear. The empath begins replaying everything. They remember the first warning sign. They remember the first time they felt confused. They remember the first major argument. They remember the moment the relationship started feeling different. They remember conversations word for word. They wonder whether they misunderstood something. They wonder whether they reacted too strongly. They wonder whether they should have left earlier. They wonder whether the other person ever truly loved them. They wonder whether one final conversation could have changed the outcome. This mental replay can feel exhausting, but it often has a hidden purpose. The mind is trying to create a coherent story. When an experience is emotionally confusing, the brain wants an explanation. It wants to know where the story began, where it changed, and why it ended. The empath may believe that if they can understand every detail, they will finally feel peace. But there is a trap here. Analysis can become another form of attachment. The person may be physically gone, but the empath is still spending hours emotionally engaging with them. Instead of communicating with the person, they are communicating with memories. Instead of asking the person questions, they are asking themselves questions that may never have clear answers. Why did they do that? Did they mean it? Did they know they were hurting me? Did they ever feel guilty? Was any of it real? Could I have changed the outcome? These questions can keep the relationship psychologically alive long after it has ended physically. The empath is still trying to solve the same emotional puzzle, and beneath all those questions is often one simple need. I need this story to make sense, because if it makes sense, perhaps the pain will feel less random. If there is a clear explanation, perhaps the empath can stop blaming themselves. But not every relationship gives you the closure you want. Sometimes the person who hurt you cannot explain themselves honestly. Sometimes they do not have the emotional insight required to give you a satisfying explanation. Sometimes they give an explanation that creates even more confusion. Sometimes they deny what happened. Sometimes they blame you. Sometimes they rewrite the history of the relationship. And when that happens, the empath has to face a difficult reality. Closure may not come from receiving the perfect explanation. It may come from accepting the pattern you already witnessed. This becomes even harder when the relationship ends without the acknowledgement the empath needed. Some endings are clean. Both people recognize that the relationship is over. They discuss what happened. They take responsibility where appropriate. They say goodbye. But other endings are full of confusion. One person may want answers while the other avoids the conversation. There may be blame, denial, silence, sudden distance, repeated contact, or promises that never become actions. The empath may be left with words they desperately wanted to hear but never received. I understand why you are hurt. I know what I did. I should have treated you differently. You did not deserve that. When those words never come, the empath can feel as if the story remains unfinished. They may believe that one final acknowledgement would finally release them, and sometimes they wait for that acknowledgement longer than they should. But the absence of accountability does not make the pain less real. Someone does not have to agree with your experience for your experience to have happened. Someone does not have to apologize for you to know that something hurt you. Someone does not have to admit what they did before you are allowed to walk away. This is one of the hardest lessons for an empath because empathy naturally encourages them to understand the other person's perspective. They may spend so much time trying to understand why the other person behaved badly that they forget to ask whether the behavior itself was acceptable. Understanding the reason behind behavior is not the same as excusing the behavior. A person can have wounds and still be responsible for how they treat others. A person can have fears and still need to manage them. A person can have a difficult history and still be accountable for their present choices. The empath can understand all of this without becoming responsible for fixing it. Then comes one of the most confusing parts of the grieving process. Missing someone you know was bad for you. This can make the empath question everything. They may wake up one morning feeling strong and certain, then suddenly remember a familiar voice, a private joke, an old message, or a peaceful moment, and the sadness returns. For a moment, the mind may focus only on what was lost. This does not automatically mean the empath wants the relationship back. Missing someone is not the same as needing them. Remembering someone is not the same as trusting them. Feeling lonely is not the same as making the wrong decision. The human nervous system becomes familiar with patterns. It becomes familiar with routines, voices, schedules, emotional rhythms, and expectations. Even a stressful relationship can become familiar. When that familiar pattern disappears, the absence can feel uncomfortable simply because it is new. Peace can initially feel empty when chaos was familiar. Silence can feel lonely when constant emotional stimulation was normal. The empath may mistake this unfamiliarity for evidence that they still need the person. But sometimes what they miss is not the mistreatment or even the person themselves. They miss familiarity. They miss having someone to think about. They miss the routine. They miss the moments when the relationship felt safe. They miss the version of themselves that still believed everything could work out. This is why healing requires patience. The brain needs time to adjust to a different emotional environment. The empath needs time to learn that peace does not have to be earned by managing someone else's emotions. They need time to discover that a quiet life can still be meaningful. They need time to experience stability without interpreting it as emptiness. And slowly the silence that once felt like abandonment can become space. Space to think, space to breathe, space to hear their own thoughts without constantly filtering them through another person's reactions. Underneath all of this is another powerful source of grief: hope. Hope may have kept the empath in the relationship longer than anything else, not because they were foolish, but because hope can make suffering feel temporary. As long as there was a possibility that tomorrow would be different, today's pain could be tolerated. The empath could say, maybe after this conversation, maybe after they calm down, maybe after they understand how much this is hurting me, maybe after they realize I am not their enemy, maybe after they finally see how much I have done for them. Hope gives the mind a reason to continue investing, but eventually the empath may reach a point where hope itself becomes painful. They begin seeing that the same pattern continues despite all their efforts. They begin understanding that they cannot love another person into emotional maturity. They cannot sacrifice enough to create accountability. They cannot communicate perfectly enough to make someone respect boundaries they do not want to respect. They cannot heal someone who refuses to participate in their own healing. Accepting this can feel brutal because it means giving up the fantasy that one final effort might change everything. It means accepting that the person may never become who the empath hoped they would become. It means accepting that the relationship may never provide the ending they wanted. It means accepting that some potential remains potential forever. That is a real loss. It deserves to be grieved. The empath may cry not because they want the pain back, but because they are finally releasing a dream they protected for a very long time. They are saying goodbye not only to a person, but to the future they built around that person. And when that happens, grief becomes less about going backward and more about accepting reality without continuing to fight it. There is also a darker truth that can completely change how the empath understands the breakup. They may realize that they had been grieving while they were still inside the relationship. They were grieving every time affection became conditional. They were grieving every time they felt unheard. They were grieving every time they realized that another promise had become another disappointment. They were grieving when conversations stopped feeling safe. They were grieving when they began hiding their feelings to avoid conflict. They were grieving when they started lowering their expectations just to survive the relationship emotionally. They were grieving when they stopped asking for what they really needed because they already knew the answer would hurt. In that sense, the breakup may not have created all the grief. The breakup may have simply removed the distractions that allowed the grief to remain hidden. While the relationship was still active, the empath had something to do. They could hope, they could fix, they could explain, they could forgive, they could wait. After the relationship ends, there is no longer anything to repair. The empath is left alone with the emotional reality they had been postponing. This can create an intense wave of sadness because the feelings are no longer being interrupted by another argument, another apology, another promise, or another moment of temporary closeness. The emotional cycle stops, and everything that was suppressed begins demanding attention. That is why someone can feel worse after leaving before they eventually feel better. Leaving can remove the immediate source of pain, but it can also create the space where the deeper pain finally becomes visible. The empath may suddenly realize how tired they were, how anxious they had become, how much they had compromised, how often they had ignored themselves, how long they had been waiting for emotional safety. And that realization can be painful because it forces them to see the cost of staying. Eventually, the empath begins to understand that healing is not simply about letting go of a person. It is about letting go of everything they had attached to that person. The fantasy, the waiting, the rescuing, the constant explaining, the need to prove that their feelings were valid, the need to receive an apology, the need to be understood by someone who repeatedly misunderstood them, the belief that patience would eventually fix the relationship, the belief that their empathy gave them a special responsibility to stay, the belief that leaving meant giving up on someone. These beliefs can be deeply rooted. For an empath, walking away may feel morally wrong at first because they are used to seeing the pain behind another person's behavior. They may think, what if that person is hurting? What if they need me? What if leaving makes me just as bad? But compassion without boundaries can become self-abandonment. You can care about someone's suffering without sacrificing your own stability. You can understand why someone behaves a certain way without accepting the behavior. You can recognize another person's wounds without becoming responsible for treating them. This is where the empath slowly starts asking different questions. Instead of asking, why did they do this to me? They may begin asking, why did I keep accepting it? Instead of asking, why couldn't I save them? They may ask, why did I believe saving them was my responsibility? Instead of asking, will they ever realize what they lost? They may ask, why do I still need them to realize it? These questions are painful because they move the focus away from the other person and back toward the self, but they also create power. The empath begins to understand that healing does not require the other person to become different. Healing requires the empath to become different in the way they respond to what they now know. They do not need to become cold. They do not need to stop caring. They do not need to lose their sensitivity. They need discernment. They need boundaries. They need the ability to recognize that empathy is a gift, but unlimited access to that gift is not an obligation. And slowly, the grief starts changing. It does not disappear overnight. It becomes clearer. The empath begins seeing that what they miss is often connected to what they hoped for, what they gave, what they imagined, and what they believed the relationship could become. The more clearly they see those layers, the less confusing the grief becomes. They can still feel sadness without interpreting sadness as a command to return. They can remember without reopening the door. They can care without chasing. They can love someone from a distance while choosing not to place themselves back inside the same pattern. And that is where the emotional meaning of the relationship begins to change, because the empath is no longer asking how to get the relationship back. They are beginning to ask how to get themselves back. In the end, the deepest grief is not always about losing the person. It is about losing the hope that the person would eventually become who you believed they could be. An empath can grieve because they loved deeply. They can grieve because they gave chances. They can grieve because they invested their time, energy, patience, understanding, and heart into something they genuinely wanted to work. They can grieve because they imagined a future that felt real to them. And they can grieve because walking away means accepting that this future may never exist. But there is a truth that becomes clearer with time. You are not necessarily grieving because you want the pain back. You are grieving because you finally understand what the relationship cost you. You are grieving the nights you spent questioning yourself, the moments you ignored your own instincts, the boundaries you allowed to disappear, the peace you traded for temporary closeness. The version of yourself that kept believing one more conversation, one more apology, or one more chance would finally make everything different. And perhaps the hardest part is realizing that you were willing to give someone the love, patience, understanding, and emotional safety that you were desperately hoping to receive in return. That realization can hurt deeply, but it can also become the moment everything changes. Because healing does not require you to pretend that you never loved them. It does not require you to erase every beautiful memory or convince yourself that every moment was fake. You are allowed to remember the good and still acknowledge the harm. You are allowed to miss someone and still choose not to return. You are allowed to feel sadness without turning that sadness into a reason to reopen a door that repeatedly hurt you. And you are allowed to mourn a future that never happened. Grief does not mean you made the wrong decision. Sometimes grief is simply what happens when the heart finally catches up with what the mind already knows. The empath does not become cold through this process. They become wiser. They become more selective. They learn that compassion does not require self-abandonment. They learn that understanding someone does not mean tolerating everything they do. They learn that love without boundaries can slowly become a place where they disappear. And most importantly, they learn that their ability to love deeply is not the problem. The real transformation happens when they finally understand where that love deserves to go. So if you are grieving a relationship you know was unhealthy, do not shame yourself for still feeling it. Do not assume that missing someone means you should go back. Sometimes the heart simply needs time to release what the mind has already accepted. Give yourself that time. Let the memories exist without letting them control your future. Let the grief move through you without turning it into a reason to return to the same cycle. Because one day, you may look back and realize that the person you were desperately trying to save was never the person you were supposed to lose yourself for. And the relationship you thought took everything from you may have actually revealed the one person you needed to find again, yourself. That is the real ending. Not becoming heartless, not getting revenge, not making the other person regret losing you. It is becoming so deeply connected to your own peace that you no longer need someone else to validate your decision to protect it. You are not grieving because you made the wrong choice. You may be grieving because you finally made the choice you were once too hopeful to make. And if this message spoke to something you have been feeling but could never explain, remember that healing is not about forgetting the past. It is about refusing to let the past decide what you believe you deserve next. If you found value in this video, subscribe to our channel for more deep psychological insights into relationships, emotional patterns, empathy, and human behavior. Give this video a like because it helps more people discover this message, and share it with someone who may still be silently trying to understand why walking away from the wrong person can hurt so much. Your story may not have ended the way you hoped, but that does not mean your story ends there. Sometimes the most painful goodbye is the doorway to the most peaceful version of yourself.